Hello everyone and welcome back to Local Liberty. This is Brian and Shane again. We are coming to you on this November 19th, 2015 to talk about a hot topic, current event again. It's been filling up the airwaves and all the news since last Friday. That would be the terrorist attacks in Paris. Very ugly situation. 120 something people died. A coordinated, well-planned attack.
Multiple sites were hit.
Throwing, I believe immediately the whole country of France declared a state of emergency. There is military everywhere guarding everything. The whole populace is thrown into a frenzy, and understandably, it's something that very disturbing.
Yeah, people aren't in the streets in Paris anymore. Now it's suddenly like an empty city. People want to stay indoors and want to go outside. So this has spawned a lot of follow-on conversation on topics like immigration. And this is spurring a very up-to-the-moment conversation happening in places like Connecticut, where people in France and around the world are starting to question their government's immigration policies for a number of different reasons. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. But before, I just want to talk a little bit about the prerequisites of what happened in Paris. A few things are worth mentioning. One is the populace in France is essentially disarmed. The gun control laws in France are not as tight as they are in some other countries, but they're still extremely restrictive. Basically, the net effect of it all is no private citizens in France carry any firearms. And I'm assuming a insignificant number of them even own firearms anymore and have them in their homes. You know, I was reading an article, I wish I could remember where it was, about European firearm ownership rates, and they say a lot of times the numbers are very deceiving for obvious reasons. Hey, do you own a gun? It's illegal to own a gun, by the way. Do you own a gun? Oh, of course not. I don't. God, that's crazy. But many people actually do have guns in their homes.
Right.
But of course, what you said about carrying the gun is probably very likely true. They're not going to carry it.
Right, because
they might have it in their home.
Right, because it's extremely illegal.
Right, very risky to get caught.
So nobody in public nobody in the theater in Paris is armed.
Right.
So there's one facet of the prerequisite for an event like that occurred in Paris is you have a disarmed population, and then tying back into something we talked about last week or a couple weeks ago, we talked about anti-discrimination laws, which in the most general sense, an anti-discrimination law restricts the freedom of association of an individual. And those are very prominent in France. There's all sorts of laws restricting your ability to not associate with someone.
Yeah, and this includes things from wage controls to quotas on how many people you need to hire if you're a business of a certain size. There's a number of things that affect your ability to do business with someone else in a voluntary way.
Right, and the particular restrictions that relate to this event have to do with ethnicity, race, religion, cultural things primarily is what this is associated with. And then the third aspect after disarmament and the anti-discrimination laws, the third aspect is very open immigration policies where large numbers of people with a very different culture, not better or worse, but different culture, they can enter into a country. And I don't have the numbers, I didn't get the chance to get any exact numbers, but the scale of immigration in the European countries over the last 30, 40 years has been really significant. And what you end up with is, and another factor that I'll mention is there's also a very robust welfare state in European countries that allows populations to live isolated from each other because they don't have to interact. So what you have is a lot of different cultures that how they can interact is tightly controlled. Everybody's disarmed, and this may sound unintuitive to you, but particularly the disarmament part is what this all creates is a recipe for conflict. And I'm not saying this creates a recipe for the conflict, those are the three things that created a terrorist attack. But these are the types of things that create circumstances where conflict and the severity of conflict is more likely. In the case of like the gun control thing, it's obvious to me that those shooters would have been stopped a lot more quickly if there were people there to respond right away, rather than in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, however many minutes it took. So what that all comes down to is setting up the likelihood for conflict, as I see it, and that ties into the term that I'm not really familiar with the usage of this term, but it's called the Hegelian dialectic, and that's something technical term in philosophy and in other areas. It's sort of distilled down into one way that it's presented is this idea of problem, reaction, solution, and what that means is something like, let's say you're a power-hungry maniac. And you want to, and your goal is X. And in this case, we'll just say X is to attain more power. What you do is you initiate a problem whereby the citizens under your control will then, after you've initiated a problem, after you've created a conflict, the citizens under your power will ask you. They will voluntarily seek that you solve their problem. Their reaction to you creating the problem will be to give you what you want. So it's a problem, reaction, solution. You create a problem. The reaction is, I need more. The reaction is, protect me, protect me, protect me. And then the solution is, okay, here, I'll protect you. I'll plant soldiers all over your country and declare martial law and a state of emergency.
The classic example of this would be the National Socialists in Germany, right? They created the Jewish problem. And then the German citizens responded, oh my God, all our woes and worries and miseries and economic hardships is because of the Jews. Well, who can solve this problem? Oh, Hitler, he knows all about the problem. Sweet.
Yep. It's basically drive people into a corner where they will react in a way you want them to react to give you what you want. And in the case of talking about, megalomaniac bureaucrats and politicians, what they want is more power. So that's a roundabout way of that's sort of the high level of how I see events like this is create conditions where conflict is more likely to occur, and then when the conflict occurs, swoop in and solve the problem by stealing a little more freedom, a little more resources, a little more of anything from the people. So that's sort of that to me is sort of the setup of how this reaction from the Paris incident leads to the next topic of discussing immigration. But before I dive into that, it's also worth noting in relation to what I just said about creating the problem, specifically how it relates to these terrorist attacks. The problem that was initiated is destroying dirt poor, mostly third world countries in the Middle East and Africa. And then you want the problem to be, you want the people to be screaming out for your protection. How do you get them to scream out for your protection? Get them to be attacked. How do you get them to be attacked? Destroy a bunch of countries and make them hate France. Like France has been right there with the good old US of A, bombing the shit out of countries for decades. And that sort of leads to these sort of events. And along those lines, I have a quote from a recent article by an author named David Stockman, who used to be a representative along several decades ago and is an economist and writes about geopolitical events, but particularly usually about economics. But here's just a couple paragraph quote. But the everlasting truth is that the relative handful of suicidal jihadi who have perpetrated murderous episodes of terror like 9/11 and this weekend's carnage in Paris did not exist in November 1989, referring to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and then the Soviet Union. And they would not be marauding the West today, save for the unrelenting arrogance, stupidity, duplicity, and mendacity of Imperial Washington since the fall of the Soviet Union, referring to basically the last two and a half decades of the United States and its Western allies just going nuts, intervening in other countries around the world. And continuing with the quote.
Which is also what Russia did with the USSR.
But and two wrongs don't make a right.
Right.
So continue with the quote. That is, the gates of hell have been opened by Washington's senseless destruction of regimes in Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, and elsewhere that refuse to do its bidding. Yet not one of these backwaters of tyranny and economic and military insignificance posed any threat whatsoever to the safety and security of American citizens in Lincoln, Nebraska, or Manchester, New Hampshire, or I could add Paris, France. So basically, that quote refers to a term you may have heard thrown around in politics, is a term called blowback. And that when you intervene in something, intervention begets intervention.
It's like
aggression.
Newton's third law of motion. Every action, there's an equal reaction. So you push back against them, they push back against you.
Right. It's aggression begets aggression. So that is sort of the way back genesis of of things like ISIS and Al Qaeda and and just that leads. You can draw a straight line from there to 2015, where 100 people get murdered in a crazy, coordinated, extremely violent attack in Paris.
How far back do you go with that? Because you can draw a line all the way back to the Crusades. You can draw a line back further to when Islam first became an actual religion and created the original caliphate. The
you can draw
Umayyad Caliphate, where they took over Spain. They took over most of North Africa. Right? I mean, humans have been at war with the other and in conflict with each other throughout human history.
Right, and understanding the cause and effect in there is the way we're going to get out of it. And when I talk about drawing lines back, you can connect all sorts of dots going back a long ways, and that's out of scope for this episode, but you can draw a straight line between 1991 Iraq and 2015 Paris.
You could keep drawing that line back though straight. I say with Iraq.
Right, you could.
That's one slight issue I have with this. I do agree that we cause a lot of harm in the world, and we have no idea what's going to happen. We can get involved in a war, and all kinds of negative outcomes occur. But there's a point where these wars and these issues were happening before we got involved, and then we were just another person to get involved. And so I just think about these issues in the Middle East have been happening since the dawn of civilization. Since Ur and the ancient civilizations of Babylon have been at war with each other. Since the Egyptians have been at war with each other in the region. Since Alexander conquered the region, the Romans conquered the region, then Islam conquered the region, then the Crusades happened. I mean, this has been a long, long area of conflict. This particular area around the Tigris River Valley, the Middle East.
But none of that justifies American intervention. And over there, and also none of that means that anybody in the Middle East was a threat to people in Connecticut.
Oh, of course.
That's just bringing it back to the immediate. The West in general this is kind of getting into reap what you sow territory. You destabilize an entire region, and guess what's going to come out of it? Instability. This isn't even the law of unintended consequences. This is intended consequence. And that was kind of the point of that quote, is saying, the other context of this article was the world was looking like it was going to become a slightly better and more peaceful place in the early 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War at that time, she said, well, there's no more Cold War, right? So the world's going to get a little bit happier place, and things are looking up. But
it did. Murder rates around the world have gone down. People in hunger have gone down. The world is a better and safer place. Terrorism as a threat to your everyday existence or anyone's existence around the world is exaggerated.
Yes,
and those regions were already destabilized.
But the point of this article was the wars in general. War had to be continued somehow, some way.
Right.
And that's what led to the cycle of intervention.
But what I'm saying is those wars have been a fact of life in that region for thousands and thousands of years, since the ancient Babylonians, the ancient Assyrian Empire, since all those ancient Persia, all those various people and conquerors throughout that region. For some reason, it's been a hotbed of conflict. And a lot of it has to do with religion, because also it's the core three monotheistic religions. They all cite areas around that region as their holy land. Jerusalem obviously being the biggest one, where Muslims and Jews and Christians are all at each other's throats because, oh, this is my holy site. No, the Wailing Wall is ours. Well, the Dome of the Rock where Muhammad rose, that's our holy site. Oh, well, the Hagia Sophia, the most ancient Christian church, oh, this is our holy site. So it's often a bit about religion, and these wars just keep happening. So I know he says here that we destabilized the region, but it was a region that was already not stable in the first place. It was already destabilized.
I mean, relatively speaking, compared to the West, sure. But our actions directly furthered its instability.
Well, here's how I would take it. Is it was already destabilized. I think the wars would have continued. But whether they would have continued or not, what is our moral goal here? Why is it our moral imperative to make them continue? Even if we do nothing, everything will be the same. We're still not doing something wrong. It's better not to cause harm just to continue a bad situation than not cause harm. It's not my fault the bad situation is continuing. I just can't do anything about it. So we can acknowledge that area is always prone to violence and problems. We don't have to get involved.
Right. That undercuts the...
Because now we're doing something wrong.
That undercuts the bringing freedom and democracy to the world. No, we're blowing up cities.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So I mean, we're okay. Yeah. So that's actually a decent transition into this. But a second part of this, which is talking about the immigration, which is a very hot topic right now in Connecticut. This morning, the news articles are continuing to come out about accepting refugees into Connecticut and into the United States in general. And there's the background of this is some states are saying no, we're not going to accept any refugees because people are rattled about what happened in Paris last week, and people are rethinking: is it in my own best interest? Is it the right thing for my safety to allow people from what you've just noted as a historically very unstable, violent region.
Yes.
Although but the point that I want to make is, violent or otherwise, it's different. It's a culture that is different than ours. So now people are questioning: is the immigration policy of just bring them in, and does it make sense? And I think also people are very rightly skeptical of when a government official says, "Oh, don't worry, we have a vetting process." I mean, people, can use their own reasoning to say, "Okay, your vetting process that lasts 5 minutes and looks at some paperwork and somebody's fake passport may not be worth all that much."
I don't know what the vetting process is for France, but it's not like that for America. I don't know what it is for France, though.
Well, I don't know what it is like for either, to tell you the truth. And what it comes down to...
It's much more difficult for America. It is not a 5-minute, let's look at things. You should go look it up online. I saw the checklist and the things you have to go through and the procedures you have to go through. It's the most difficult way to get into the country, as far as I can tell. There are various other ways to get into the country, from just sneaking over the border, to getting student visas, work visas. There's other methods that are just far easier than obtaining refugee status. And there's also some other things that I was interested when I was learning about the refugee status in America. I was talking to a couple of my teachers at school. Both are interested in foreign affairs. One's a political scientist, and they were telling me like a lot of things that we give to them, they're actually required to pay it back. Unlike some other people, where it's more like a loan. So they're allowed to come in, escape from whatever brutality that they're from, which also is very difficult too. Apparently, the vast majority of refugee applications are rejected. It's an extremely small amount that are actually approved.
I think there's one.
It might be more difficult in France.
There's one current difference. This is just conjecture on my part, but I have a feeling that process, that very arduous process that you described, I'm sure it has a political expedience shortcut button, and when that's just my intuition. That's what my intuition tells me, that they're accepting war refugees from Bangladesh
Yeah.
goes through the
I didn't see that because that's specifically what refugees are. There are for these horrible situations, and I didn't see that. Neither of my teachers talked about that. They talked about the various things you have to go through, and it's a difficult process.
But I mean, I think to me, intuition says
Yeah,
it's possible that
Sure.
that procedures can be circumvented and short-circuited as any politician as any politician with enough weight desires.
That applies to anything, though. That
Yes.
people can cut corners
Of course,
and half-ass it.
people can ignore
That-
constitutions.
But
I mean,
that applies to personal interactions. That can apply to anything you want to say. That this is not going to be exactly how
correct.
it is.
It does. So now to move this forward into the discussion of immigration in Connecticut today, this is becoming as expected, a extremely polarizing topic. As is people's reaction to what happened in Paris last week. Very polarizing, creates very contentious conversations. And to me, my explanation as to why it's so contentious is because people know that the conversation is more than just a persuasive debate where I have my perspective and I'm going to try to persuade you and you're going to try to do the same to me. It's tangled up in the conflict-ridden aspect of a society that's based on public property, and a very large portion of property in this country is deemed public in one way or another when you think of the amount of money that flows up to the government and then flows elsewhere. A lot of resources are tangled up in the concept of public something, public property. So what this means is, if you could imagine a world, or imagine a Connecticut that was not like that, and our state was based on individual freedom to the greatest extent you can imagine. In this situation, it would be about, okay, a private group or a private person is bothered and upset and concerned about the plight of Syrian refugees, and they're going to invite them to come to Connecticut and help them build a better life. And that would be the end of the story.
So I have a quick question for you then. So let's just say some of these Syrian refugees, they have family here. Family says, hey, come on over, come live with me. You cool with that?
Of course.
All right, continue.
That would be a private property transaction. That would be an invitation.
So your issue, see, a lot of the people's issue is not specifically what we're talking about. They think that the Syrian refugees, the refugees in general, are this overblown threat. They think, oh, it's just too unsafe to allow them in, but the evidence doesn't show that's the case. So,
okay, yes.
so that is the issue for some people, and they might go, hey, you know what? Maybe I'd band together some people, open a shelter or whatever, and let them in. If I didn't have this misconception about the harm these people cause, and about the percentage of the people that are refugees and are actually terrorists or are going to cause violent acts.
And that is a perfectly valid conversation to have with somebody, to persuade them that you have the belief that the danger level is not what they think it is. But here's why the issue is so contentious, because it doesn't matter how many people in Connecticut say, don't do this, it's dangerous, they're going to come here anyway. That's why the issue is contentious. It's because it's based on force. It's based on whether or not you feel safe with having 10 or 100 or 10,000 refugees from any country coming to Connecticut. They're going to come regardless of your.
What you're saying, though,
regardless of what your personal position is. And that's why this is a contentious issue.
Right, but I think I'm being a little confusing here. If those 10,000 people came here, and they all had a home to go to, they all had a family, they all had the shelter to go to, it'd be fine. So it's not so much about letting 10,000 people in because it'd be a danger. That's not, you don't even care about that. It's letting 10,000 people in onto property that I own that I don't want you to come onto. But if that issue wasn't the case, then it'd be fine. We can have 100,000 if everyone has a home. If one out of every two people, that's obviously not going to happen, let's just imagine this, one out of every two people in Connecticut said, yeah, I'll take in a refugee, then that'd be cool, because they're all volunteering to do it.
Taken, and what implies with the concept of I will take in a refugee is I'm responsible for my guests.
Right, you're going to house them, blah, blah, blah.
Right, responsible both from a resource perspective, I'm going to house them, feed them, take care of them, but I'm also responsible for their actions. I'm responsible for, if I bring a guest, if I bring a refugee as my as my guest into my home and they go out and cause some problems, then I'm responsible for my guests. That is how private property operates.
Yeah, I don't agree with that, because if, say I had a relative in, we'll pick nice friendly Norway. Hey, come on over, Ragnar. Come on over and stay with me. Oh, cool. If Ragnar comes over and stays with me, and then Ragnar kind of is crazy and thinks he's still a Viking and goes out and chops people up with an axe. I'm not responsible for Ragnar. I didn't know you'd do that. All right?
Well, I think we have precedent that I see what you're saying, but I think we have precedent in that says otherwise in some cases.
Yeah, I don't agree with that precedent. It's the same way if you invite someone from another state. Hey, my relative, my whatever's coming over, he's come over here, and then suddenly he does something horrible. I mean, what you're talking about is like guardianship in terms of like someone that's underage or can't act for themselves. Then you have to make a decision for them. They have a mental handicap, or if they're a child, and then they do something wrong. It's like, well, that was your responsibility. But once they're an adult, it's a little different. If you know, on the other hand, I'm inviting over a mass murderer, so you knew this, you're causing everyone harm, you knew it. That'd be different. But if you're just invited over, Uncle Ragnar, and he goes crazy, that's different.
Yeah. So I see your point, and I guess what I'm saying is you're not entirely responsible. I guess what I'm saying is you're not entirely responsible. Like if you invite your buddy over from the next town over.
Actually, I'll help you out, Brian. Here's how what your situation works.
If you vouch for somebody.
Is if you don't know that person. One of these refugees, someone might say, "Oh, I'll let some guy come to my house. I have no idea who he is. He's a refugee. He's on the list. I checked my box off, and he came in." That's where I think you would apply, because now you're just letting some random dude into your house, and you don't know what he's going to do to everyone else. Like, I'm helping a refugee out.
Right. That's what I mean by because
you don't know that person.
Right. If it's a personal invitation on some level, then it's kind of like, hey, I vouch for somebody. It's like, yeah, that guy's cool. Let him in. That's what I mean by that level of responsibility. And I guess this is maybe hard to imagine. It's like, well, I don't know anybody in Syria. How am I going to personally invite somebody?
But some people do. Some people have family.
Right, exactly. You may have family, or I think the way this would more likely play out is people would form private groups, private organizations, and they would have a representative that go to Syria and say, okay, we find some families that they need help. We're going to help them, but they're not going to say, we're not going to bring back the guy that's looking. That guy that has a shirt that says, I want to go kill somebody.
Right.
They're not going to bring that guy back. So I guess I'm describing something again, and this is, I'm a broken record on this, but I'm describing something that's decentralized. Decentralization is my path to the better world.
Right. But this whole conversation has shown to me, what I was talking about before we started recording, is this is a complicated issue, and you can take it from different perspectives. Right, you can say this way or that way, and the government intervention in this situation confuses the issue.
Absolutely,
right? That's problematic.
It confuses the issue, and it creates conflict where there doesn't necessarily have to be.
Right, it creates weird incentives. It creates conflict. It creates all these artificial elements that people just interacting naturally, they wouldn't exist. But now you get this weird thing just thrown in. It's like, here, just throw this into the mix. Now it's all topsy-turvy, you know what I mean? It's all slightly askew.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned acting naturally, because that's another point I want to hit on, is what a lot of this conflict boils down to is not the individual level. It's really not about, well, I'm concerned about, I'm concerned about the one person that you're bringing is bad, but those people are good. It's not really an individual thing. People have what I think is a legitimate concern at the cultural level. The natural way that cultures change over time is really slowly. They change through individuals and small groups and just a small adjustments here or there that over the course of years or decades could amount to very large change. But the peaceful, conflict-free way that cultures change is very slowly.
That's changed in the modern world a bit. It's still slow, but it's significantly. Well, the change is faster than it ever has been before.
It could be faster, yes, because of the technological ability to communicate.
I mean, you can just see that if you look at historic societies, where you can look at very simple things, fashion trends. Fashion in America today 5 years ago you're wearing certain clothes, you're like, what are you wearing that for? That's not in style anymore. But if you look historically, like maybe like ancient Rome, you'll see people wearing certain styles of clothing for longer periods. There is fashion change, but it's longer before that change happens.
So
right? In the modern day, change happens more quickly.
Okay, so I can live with that. Change may happen quicker in the modern day, but deep cultural change still does not happen overnight.
No,
and it does not happen from the level of, hey, here comes 100,000 new people into your area. Like in some of the stuff you read about, it makes me question if it's actually true, because it sounds insane about these like small little towns in the Alps in Austria or Germany or France, and hey, here's, there's 700 people live in the town. Here's 5,000 refugees that you have to house in your town. It's like, man, talk about cultural upheaval. And this is the government saying, okay, we have a building, now these 5,000 people are going to live in your town. That's an extreme example of the underlying concern that people have in the back of their minds, that they have a culture that we live in, they like the culture as any well-adjusted person does, and they're legitimately concerned that if you import massive amount of people at a very short period of time, their culture is going to be impacted in a way that they don't like. And that, to me, I think is one of the background themes of why this is such a contentious issue.
You're right. If it was so massive, the population you're bringing in, that the native culture might be subsumed by the larger culture. It's hard for me to think where that's happened. Like, because in America, we've had massive amounts of immigration throughout the years. We had things like Little Italy, Chinatown, popping up in cities all over America. But America's a huge country. There's millions of people, and always, and we see this even today, even though people don't like to admit it, people assimilate. In the first generation, half the people won't ever learn the English language, just like the Italians, just like the Chinese, just like other groups. Historically, the French, they didn't learn the English language, a significant portion of them, but their kids knew the English language. And often by the third generation, they didn't even speak the language. They might have still understood it, and usually by the fourth generation, it was entirely lost. That's slightly changing because the value about languages and cultures has shifted a little, because worldwide, being bilingual or trilingual is the norm. Where in America, it's like, if you don't speak English, then get out. That's that idea is kind of receding a bit, because you can speak more than one language. That's actually possible. Look at people from like Sweden who can speak fluently like 3 languages. That you can do that. But still, the overall change of being assimilated into society still occurs.
Right. In this case that we're talking about is a culture that is very different from the West, from the United States.
Right, like the Chinese, very dramatically different culture, but they assimilated. The Japanese, again, dramatically different culture,
right.
They assimilated. The same thing will happen for the Muslim immigrants. Same thing. You see this for Muslims that have been here for a few generations. You see them adopting Western styles of dress, Western values. Mm-hmm. I've met many of them that I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize you're a Muslim at first until you told me, right? Oh, I gotta go pray. Oh, really? What? Well, oh, yeah, Muslim. Oh, I didn't.
Right. So I mean, none of this is to say that.
But it will change if you have a very small population, like America has a big population.
Yeah.
It's like the 700 people in that town you mentioned, and you had 5,000 people come in there. Well, now they're the majority population. So
right, it's upheaval. Right. It's like serious upheaval. But I mean, I'm not saying like, migration mechanisms haven't worked in the past. But this is just this, and again, this all comes back to problem, reaction, solution. We've engineered a culture in the United States where people are afraid of Muslims. People are afraid of people from the Middle East.
It's true.
And that's part of, in some ways, all conflict is good in that it benefits the power hungry, because all and any conflict results in people seeking safety. Remember, we talked about this a long time ago we talked about war and foreign policy. People have a natural tendency to seek leadership. People also
Definitely.
Can be very prone to feeling victimized. And in the moment you feel victimized, you feel
you have the authority to do what you want. You're entitled to do what you want.
You have some moral authority to redress a grievance.
Right.
So you got to convince people that they've been victimized, and you got to convince people they're under attack. And what do you know? At the end of the day, they're begging to be taken care of. And understanding that cycle of problem, reaction, solution, where we are cornered into
into a crisis. Then we ask for somebody to save us from the crisis. And what do you know? They save us from the crisis by taking away another chunk of our freedom.
One other thing I want to mention before we end the show today is the way a few people, a minority of people, are talking about this problem. And I've seen it from left to right, from different sides, different groups. But I first noticed this. Someone commented about an article on Salon.com, on Reason.com. They said, wow, it's really strange the way they're describing the situation. It's almost like they're not talking about people. There's no actual human actors in the situation. It's very mechanical and very sociopathic. It's like, there's actually people involved in the situation. And I see people, and you see this all the time. There's a mass murder, there's some gun shooting, and immediately certain politicians will jump in on it, and they won't even really talk about like the lives at stake. They'll immediately talk about political issues, like, well, here's the thing, we need blah 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 blah. It's like you realize you're talking about actual people on the ground that their lives are affected. So whether you think having refugees in the country is good, bad, or otherwise, or whether you think what we're talking about is good, bad, or otherwise, all the things we're talking about involve individual actors. They have actual people with actual feelings that have to live their lives. Whether you're the Syrian refugee whose life really sucks because you've been displaced from your homeland, or you're the person that doesn't want your life being disrupted by Syrian refugees. Right? There's people involved, emotions involved. It's not just pieces on a chessboard, which I see people talking about it. Some people on both sides, that's how they talk about it.
Yeah.
There's no actual people. They're not considering the harm, the aggression, not considering really any of that. It's like, well, I have a certain political position. Let's immediately just throw this out here. I mean, before the Paris attacks were even done, right? In the midst of the Paris attacks, same thing happened on 9/11, by the way. Commentators came on the air, the talking heads, and some of them they just immediately started ramming the other side. Oh, yes, it's so stupid, blah blah blah. And it's like there are people involved in the situation, right? You realize a whole bunch of people have lost their lives, a whole bunch of people are scared. Maybe you might want to comment a little bit on that. Just acknowledge it's a human problem, not like a computer or mechanical or weird. I don't even know what you're talking about problem.
How that plays out in the high-level political world at the TV press release is the obligatory opening statement of "Our hearts go out."
That I don't like either.
To the families of blah 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 and the people that are suffering of blah 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 blah. But
I also don't like that.
I can tell you, the folks that develop the policies and come up with the plans that result in cities getting destroyed, millions of refugees getting created, families getting murdered and torn apart, those folks do not lose any sleep at night. They get up in front of that podium and they express their condolences, and then they sleep tight. Despite what they're expressing condolences for is the actions that they had a direct role in creating. Right.
So we need to hear Hillary Clinton, or I think like any of the Republican candidates, right? They say, "Oh, we feel bad for the citizens of France." They say the line. They give the line, blah blah blah. We feel bad. America stands united, blah blah blah. And then they immediately start talking about war and brutalizing people, and let's send troops over there, missiles over there. And again, Hillary does this so well. She's just as much of a war hawk as Republicans, as far as I can tell, based on the debates.
Hillary Clinton is a neocon.
Yeah.
Tried and true.
Yes.
So, all right. Thanks for listening to that discussion on Paris and how it relates to Connecticut, immigration.
Where can they get more local liberty action,
They can get more local liberty at Facebook and YouTube. Local liberty, put it in quotes, 2 words, as well, localliberty.org.
Check it out. We always got more articles on localliberty.org.
Mm-hmm. And localliberty.ct
.ct
at gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you guys soon.